Welcome to Listen Here, the audiobook podcast where we bring you chapter listens of our much-loved audiobooks and sometimes special guest appearances. Paul English. Does the name ring a bell? If you're a Willie Nelson fan, it might. For 70 years, Paul was Willie's right-hand man, his drummer, bodyguard, accountant, and partner in crime. Paul and Willie were so close, their friendship was immortalized in the 1971 song Me and Paul, a travelogue that chronicled some memorable, and possibly illegal, mishaps in Laredo, Milwaukee, and Buffalo. Now with the same love and dedication, Willie has immortalized their friendship in his new book, Me and Paul, Untold Stories of a Fabled Friendship. I've got this song that begs to be a book, and a book that begs to read like a song. A long, romping ballad of sweetness and scandal bridging 7 decades of friendship, Willie says. If you wanted to hear more behind-the-scenes details of what Willie teased in his song, you'll love this story. You'll hear all about the two men roaming the country, putting on shows, getting into scrapes, raising money for good causes, and bringing the joy of music to fans worldwide. You'll also hear all about their legendary misadventures, many of which have gone untold. Until now. Hear how Paul swooped in and saved Willie time and time again. How he was there to believe in his best friend when Willie lost faith in himself. With an outfit like the devil, but a heart of gold, Paul English was the steady force in Willie's life until he passed away in 2020 at the age of 87. Willie deems Paul his closest friend who will live in his heart forever. And after hearing these stories, I have no doubt he'll live in yours as well. So grab your best friend and listen to the beginning of Me and Paul. Do you love books? Of course you do. That's why you're here. So we want to let you in on our secret book club BFF, Page Chaser. Page Chaser is an online community for book lovers. From fiction, self-care, spirituality, and more, they're here to bring you what's bingeable and quizable. Page Chaser's community is constantly working to fill your TBR list. Follow their blog, sign up for their newsletter, or check out their Instagram lives, stories, and reels for sneak peeks and join in on the fun. Everything from new releases, deals, and monthly giveaways, there's something for every book lover at Page Chaser. Connect with Page Chaser on Facebook, follow them on Instagram at page.chaser, or sign up for their newsletter at pagechaser.com and let them know what you love reading. Now tell us, do you dog ear?
A note from a ghost. I'm coming up on my 50th year as a ghostwriter. It's a beautiful gig. I've loved collaborating with everyone from Marvin Gaye to Val Kilmer to Cornel West to Janet Jackson to Ray Charles. Each time, I've relished the role of being the invisible author. On this occasion, I've chosen to step forward before turning the story over to Willie. I'm doing so to explain that, unlike It's a Long Story, My Life, a previous book I wrote with Willie, Me and Paul is not a straight autobiography. This is something different, a collection of tales, some short, some tall, told by Willie Nelson and his best friend, Paul English. Being in Willie's world for decades, I've spent long hours with both men. In eliciting the essence of their characters, I've taken the poetic license to adorn their stories. As extravagant storytellers themselves, by the way, Paul and Willie freely took that same license. Novelist Philip Roth argued that one of literature's great lies is that autobiography is built on fact. To paraphrase a quote often attributed to him, memories lie while fiction should tell the truth. That mixture of memory and imagination, of fiction and fact, is the key to enduring stories. Leslie Fieldler, a critic of American literature and a personal mentor, once told me, fabulous narratives are all built on the mythic expansion of reality. I view Willie and Paul as larger-than-life characters who generously and enthusiastically provided me with the stories that constitute this memoir. Have I embellished those stories? Yes. Have I, for the sake of drama, expanded the reality on which those stories were based? Yes. Have I tried to give this book a mythic reality of its own? Yes. Am I humbled to have been entrusted to work whatever magic great storytelling requires? Yes. Have I tried to tap into the extravagant imaginations of Willie Nelson and Paul English? Yes. Do I hope that you, our beloved reader, will go along for the ride? Yes, yes, yes. Your ghost, David Ritz. Texas, present day. Sitting on a beat-up leather couch in the study of my ranch outside Austin, listening to my rescue horses whining and feeling the relief of an evening breeze, I find myself lost in thought. In 2020, my closest friend left me into the infinite abyss. The mission of this book is to bring him back. Don't get me wrong, I don't confuse myself with God. I can't resurrect the dead any more than I can turn water to wine. I'm in pretty good shape for someone pushing 90. I'm at that age when I've long stopped fussing around and started focusing on stuff that matters. Remembering Paul matters. If anyone, Paul must be immortalized. An unlikely drummer, an unlikely angel. If anyone is qualified to tell his story, it's me. Storytelling is beautiful because it brings people joy, recreates life, turns old reality to new reality. Storytelling reimagines a world from way back when and carries that world into the present day. The people in stories, long dead, get to breathe and speak and laugh and cry all over again. I get to be with those people. I get to hear all that laughing and crying. I get to relive and share those adventures with you. Why were Paul and I so devoted to each other? Good question. That's another reason I wrote this book, to show the mystical connection between me and Paul. How many people have I met in my life? Hundreds of thousands, maybe even 1 million. Preachers, presidents, the rich, the poor, and everyone in between. Yet, of those countless folks, this one guy understood me like no one else. He understood me on the deepest level imaginable. Likewise, I understood him. How is it we could communicate without even talking? One look was all we needed. In my case, my only sibling is my sister, Bobby. Paul became the brother I never had. In Paul's case, he had siblings, wonderfully talented people, and yet our bond felt deeper than blood. It was unbreakable. It defied understanding. It was like I knew him before we ever met. And now that he's gone, he's still here. He still knows me. He still lives in my heart and in the hearts of everyone whose lives he touched. Another thing about Paul, I owe him big time. The man saved my life more times than I can remember. He did so out of brotherhood. He became my drummer and made a decent living, but hell, if he had stuck to the life he'd been living before he bumped into me, he'd have been a billionaire. Some of the characters Paul knew in his youth, criminal masterminds like Benny Binion, are legendary. Matter of fact, Paul arranged for us to play at Binion's 83rd birthday party. Binion, who wasn't nearly as crafty as Paul, wound up owning half of Las Vegas and earned status as an iconic gangster. The purpose of this book is to ensure Paul's iconic status. I'm out to honor him, not because he was perfect, but because he was loved. It's been said that a good friend knows all your best stories, but a best friend has lived them with you. Well, that was us. Picture a towering, larger-than-life human being, a fearless man who for decades, single-handedly, protected me and my band of wandering minstrels from a world that wasn't quite ready for us. In every unsteady situation, Paul stayed steady. Paul stayed strong. In the Willie Nelson family, he stood in the center. He was the papa bear, the big brother, the wise uncle, the money man, the bag man, the deal maker, the sharpest shooter, and the kindest heart. Let me start off with a story. Memphis, 1977. The 16th of August. Elvis had just dropped dead, and the news swept across the country like wildfire. We were playing Memphis's Mid-South Coliseum, one of the city's biggest venues. Because of Elvis's sudden passing, I was in shock. I'd been an Elvis fan ever since I was a DJ in the 1950s, spinning his first hits on KVAN up in Portland and Vancouver. Elvis was a musical giant who showed all us aspiring musicians how to mix and mess with the categories, from country to gospel to rock and roll, and come up with something fresh. So, there in the city of Graceland, it was an emotional evening. My buddy, Delbert McClinton, a singer-songwriter rooted in rhythm and blues, opened the show and, in tribute, sang some of the King's hits. When it was time for me and my band to come on, I took a different approach. I reached back into the Great American Songbook and decided to sing Over the Rainbow. In thinking of Elvis's untimely passing, that seemed the right sentiment. It also felt right to ask Jerry Lee Lewis up on stage to sing the song with me. I'd seen Jerry Lee backstage before the show. I had great respect for the man. Along with Elvis, Johnny Cash, and Carl Perkins, he was part of the $1 Million Quartet recorded by Sun Records right there in Memphis. That became a musical milestone. Like Elvis, Jerry Lee was a pioneer. Also like Elvis, Jerry Lee started out in gospel. He began with his cousins, Jimmy Swaggart, later a famous televangelist, and Mickey Gilley, a friend of mine whose career took off when the movie Urban Cowboy was filmed in his club in Pasadena, Texas. For years, Jerry Lee had been a legend. Part of that legend, though, was his nickname, The Killer. 9 months earlier, Jerry Lee had been arrested outside Graceland. Word came down that he was looking to kill Elvis. Naturally, Jerry Lee denied it. He claimed he was wasted when he crashed into the Graceland gates. Elvis watched it all happening on his closed-circuit TV. His people called the cops, who found a loaded pistol in Jerry Lee's brand-new Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow and hauled him off to jail. Elvis had no problem ordering the officers to lock him up. A few months later, Jerry Lee put out a song called Middle Age Crazy. I relay this backstory to let you know what was on my mind when Jerry Lee came to the mic and instead of harmonizing with me, yelled out to the crowd, "I will be your new king." Seeing and smelling that Jerry Lee was drunk, I figured I'd better leave well enough alone. I didn't say a word. By then, he'd gone to the piano bench where my sister Bobby was seated, put his arm around her, and started banging away. Bobby got up and left. Next thing I knew, Jerry Lee was lifting the piano off its legs and slamming it on the floor, all while shouting obscenities at me for reasons I couldn't quite get. That's when Paul took over. Paul had my back. Paul always had my back. I mean that in every way possible. He had my back because his drums were behind me, and like a baseball catcher facing the field in front of him, he saw all the action. But he also had my back no matter where we were, on the bus, at a card game, or prying our pay from some two-timing promoter. He did all this wearing an ensemble that would come to be his signature look, a jet black suit topped off with a long cape lined in red silk that gave him the demeanor of the devil. So, on this night of the day that Elvis died, the killer had to deal with Lucifer's angel himself. Typical of Paul, his action was understated. He did the least to impact the most. In this instance, he reached into his gig bag, pulled out his .45, placed it atop his snare drum, turned to J.W., Jerry Lee's manager, who was standing in the wings, and said, "First I'm going to blow your brains out, then I'm going to shoot Jerry Lee straight through the heart." Seconds later, J.W. dragged Jerry Lee off stage while I went back to crooning Over the Rainbow, dedicated to the eternal spirit of Elvis Presley. No, Paul did not mess around. That's where his power resided. If he said he was going to do something, he did it. Either you got out of his way or he'd mow you down. You didn't want to bullshit Paul, not if you valued your life. But there was a whole lot more to Paul than his wayward proclivities. Underneath the tough guy, he was all heart. He was loyal to the young people who flocked around him like disciples around a guru. Where others were tormented by indecision, Paul was blessed with clarity. He had his own brand of bulletproof morality that won the respect of those he encountered. That is something to admire. It was something I noticed from the very first time we met. Fort Worth, 1955. Mark Twain once said, "If you tell the truth, you don't have to remember anything." He's also often credited with having said, "The secret of getting ahead is getting started." So I'll heed Twain's words and get started by telling as much of the truth as I can remember. I mention Twain because, as you'll soon see, there's something about my friendship with Paul that reminds me of Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn. Tom was more civilized and Huck was wilder, although I was plenty wild at age 22. I'd have to say Paul was wilder. Like Tom and Huck, though, we became a team. Nothing could or would ever separate us. If someone tries to tell my story without putting Paul by my side, don't bother reading it. Let me paint the picture. I was living smack dab in one of the most boring decades in American history, except I wasn't bored. I had a job at radio station KCNC. I even had a tagline. I was your old cotton-picking, snuff-dipping, tobacco-chewing, stump-jumping, gravy-sopping, coffee-pot dodging, dumpling-eating, frog-gigging hillbilly from Hill County, Texas. I beat back boredom by hustling, and whenever I could, I aligned my hustle with music. If I couldn't hustle up a job playing and singing somewhere, the next best thing was to hustle up a DJing job. That tagline, by the way, was true. I did come from the tiny town of Abbott, the heart of Hill County, and I had picked cotton and all the rest. If you called me a hillbilly, you wouldn't be wrong, and I wouldn't be mad. I couldn't ever stay mad at anyone for long, and still can't, by the way, because music takes up so much space inside my head, and music makes me happy. Even in the super-conformist 1950s, music, great music, was everywhere. Elvis went on TV for the first time on the program Louisiana Hayride, and shortly after, Heartbreak Hotel and Hound Dog were racing up the charts. This was also the year when you could buy a loaf of bread for $1 and a gallon of gas for 29 cents. I know because I also pumped gas. The Fort Worth Star-Telegram cost a nickel. But who wanted to buy the paper when all the news was about Joe McCarthy, a paranoid asshole who saw commies hiding under every bed in the house? Better to stick with music. Better to hang out with great musicians, namely my big sister Bobby, who'd moved to Fort Worth, where she was among the first in the city to play the spanking new version of the Hammond B3 organ. I'd also befriended Paul Buskirk, who, like Bobby, was a genius-level player. He knew the work of my guitar hero, Django Reinhardt, note for note. Buskirk's main instrument was banjo, but he could play anything. He was on a TV show on Channel 5 in Dallas with Freddie Powers, a singer who, like me, had studied the records and shows of Bob Wills and his Texas Playboys, the kings of Western swing. Bobby, Buskirk, and Freddie were huge influences because they knew, played, and combined so many styles of music, everything from country to jazz to crooners like Bing Crosby. Together, we'd listen to Ernest Tubb or Duke Ellington or Chet Atkins or Bill Haley and his Comets rocking around the clock. They didn't discriminate. They didn't care about categories. Music was either good or bad, exciting or dull, fun or flat. KCNC wasn't much more than a couple of windowless rooms with primitive equipment. The space was tight. The show was called The Western Express, where, in addition to playing records, I played live. Sometimes Buskirk and Freddie accompanied me. While they were on the air, I was content to help promote the songs Buskirk was putting out on a little label called Lynn. I was more than content when Buskirk had Freddie record a song I'd just written called Heartaches of a Fool. We never found anyone to release it, but I was still thrilled to hear it sung by a singer as good as him. As a writer, my confidence was on the upswing. Paul Buskirk and Freddie Powers weren't the only two musicians who came by KCNC. A drummer named Tommy Rosnowski and a guitarist named Oliver English were also in the mix. Like Buskirk, Oliver wasn't just a virtuoso, he was a scholar. He taught me about Spanish guitarists like Andres Segovia and jazz guitarists like Charlie Christian. A Fort Worth native, Oliver had jammed in every club you could name, from the Buckets of Blood to the fancy ballrooms. As a white guy, he was so great he got a pass to play at the downtown Black Hotel, the New Gem, where he sat in with beboppers who were knocked out when they heard him riffing over lines written by Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, and Thelonious Monk. Sometimes Oliver would talk about his granddad, who, back in the day, was considered the finest fiddler in Texas, even better than Bob Wills. Oliver did more than play guitar. He made guitars. He bent the wood in the bathroom. He sculpted the instruments by hand, and he learned to electrify the guitar and use a television set as an amplifier. Oliver was a certified genius. He also had a brother whom he brought over to the station. It was Oliver who made the introduction. Willie Nelson, Meet Robert Paul English. He goes by Paul. "Hey, man, I thought you were a lot older," Paul said in his nasal Texas twang. "Why do you say that?" I asked. "Listening to you on the radio, you sound older. Hearing you sing, you also sound older." "How am I supposed to take that?" "Take it as a compliment," Big Brother Oliver said. "I meant it as a compliment," Paul added. "You sound like a guy who's been around and has something real to write about." "Well," I joked, "I've been to Waco and Waxahachie." "Willie's being modest," Oliver said. "He's been to Eugene, Oregon. He was a big star on the radio up there." "More of a big bust," I added. I'd been a DJ in Eugene when I'd gone to visit my mom, but then my ratings tanked and I wound up working as a plumber's assistant. "Looks like you're doing all right in Fort Worth," Paul said with genuine encouragement. "Are you a musician like your brother and granddad?" I asked. "More a bookkeeper like my dad," Paul explained. He said that his father had also been a clerk at the county courthouse. Mr. English, who started off in pre-typewriter times, had perfect calligraphy. Later, he became a machinist at Convair, the aeronautical giant that turned into General Dynamics and Lockheed. He and his wife, both Pentecostal Christians, had 4 talented children: Oliver, Paul, Nadine, and Billy. "A bookkeeper," Oliver smiled. "Paul, give the man your real story." "You mentioned Waxahachie," Paul whispered with a twinkle in his eye. "I'm not allowed down there no more." "Why is that?" "Got myself into some trouble." "What kind of trouble?" "Running a craps game." I had a soft spot in my heart for guys who ran craps games. As a kid growing up, my best buddy, Zeke Varnon, ran craps games all over Hill County. He was a dominoes champ and a card shark. Zeke was 6 years older than me. Paul was only 6 months older, but in some ways reminded me of Zeke. He lived outside the law. Decades later, Bob Dylan said, "To live outside the law, you must be honest." That describes both Zeke and Paul. Paul was long, lean, and lanky. When we started talking, he was also candid, nothing to hide. Like Huck Finn, he was a free soul, eager for and unafraid of any adventure that might come his way. "As a young teenager, I was arrested 100 times, he told me. He also said he'd made the Fort Worth Press's top 10 most unwanted criminals list 5 years in a row. He wasn't boasting, just explaining what he'd been doing with his life. He said, "Whenever there was a murder, the cops would come and ask, 'Where's Paul?' If I wasn't there, the cops always made the same remark. He must have left. They linked me to 3 murder trials, but none of them stuck. The only one where I was out and out accused happened when 6 of us were in a shootout. Me and my buddies had been cheated at cards, and I wasn't about to let the cheaters get away. One of those cheaters got hit when he ran out of bullets. Well, that's not murder, not in Texas anyway. The jury agreed, and I was set free as a bird. Later, I learned to pick locks. That's how I wound up in a Waxahachie jail cell. But I picked that lock, too. They never bothered to recapture me because they didn't think I was worth it. The way I made real money was running willing women. Good work, but hard work. Ran it like a regular business. Fixed it with certain hotels so that customers could charge the ladies as an entertainment expense. Might have been the first guy, at least in Texas, to make that arrangement. You might ask, why would I decide to trust this guy with my entire life? My answer is easy. I liked him. Liked being around him. Liked his gutsy outlook on life. Liked that he was razor sharp and the best damn storyteller I'd ever met. His rebellious streak brought out mine. Paul made me braver, more willing to take chances, more ready to tackle life's big challenges. Instinct rarely steers you off course. Paul also really appreciated my music. His brother Oliver, 10 times the musician I'll ever be, must have also told Paul that I had a future as a singer or writer. The fact that I was quite literally a Sunday school teacher at the Metropolitan Baptist Church at the time, and also a salesman of the Encyclopedia Americana and Kirby vacuum cleaners, didn't mean I looked down on anyone who was off the beaten path. I was interested in the whole wide world, and the world of Fort Worth, especially its underworld, was downright fascinating. In that world, 23-year-old Paul English was already a legend. If Dallas had ambitions to be high class, Fort Worth didn't give a damn about all that. That's another thing I liked about Paul. He was Fort Worth to the core. Regret wasn't part of his vocabulary. My tiny hometown, Abbott, was agricultural. I was a country boy. Paul was a city boy who'd grown up with the kind of gangsters I'd only read about in books. When we met, I'd already had a good taste of cowtown culture. I'd grown up on Westerns. My heroes were Gene Autry, Roy Rogers, Lash LaRue, and Whip Wilson. They sang, played guitar, and got the girls. But that didn't mean that I hated the bad guys. No, sir. The cattle rustlers, card sharks, and gunslingers who tore up the saloons made those movies fun. Without them, the heroes couldn't be heroes. Sometimes the guys on the wrong side of the law were more interesting than the heroes themselves. That's why I found Fort Worth, a city I called Honky-Tonk Central, a scintillating scene. It smelled of the Old West. It claimed to be where the West begins. Slaughterhouses over here, whorehouses over there, a section south of downtown called Hell's Half Acre where hell was raised every night of the week. Even more hell was happening on the Jacksboro Highway, a 6-mile strip on the north side heading toward Wichita Falls. Some called it Thunder Road. Others called it the Highway to Hell. I got to know it well because that's where live music was pouring out of a long lineup of nightclubs, restaurants, and motels. Some of those places were fancy, some nasty. It was anything goes, so that's where I went. When I arrived, things were turning a little seedy. The old-timers told me about the glory days when Sinatra sang at the Showboat with Tommy Dorsey and the big bands of Benny Goodman and Harry James played the Skyliner. In my day, there were still a few fancy joints, but if I was lucky, I got a gig at a barroom called the Bloody Bucket. Paul knew these places like the back of his hand. That day we met at the studio, he asked me if I'd heard of the City Dump. I hadn't. It's over on Hanley Drive, he said. You know why it's called the City Dump? Nope. 'Cause it's next to the City Dump. You don't want to play there. 'Cause of the smell? 'Cause of that thing that happened a few months back. What happened? A cowboy shouted out some song he wanted the band to play. When the band didn't play it, the dude pulled out his pistol and shot up the joint. Anyone hurt? Only the guitarist. How bad? I asked. Well, if you want to see for yourself, he's over at the morgue. This was no joking matter, but the way Paul told the story, you had to laugh. Something like that wouldn't happen to me, I said. Why is that? Paul asked. I'd play any song the cowboy wanted to hear. Are we going to play anything tonight? Paul's brother Oliver asked as he started tuning his guitar. I'm missing a drummer, I said. Paul's a musician, Oliver said. He plays trumpet and he can also keep time. Unlike myself, I admitted. Get that cardboard box over there, Paul, and grab some brushes. I think I have a snare somewhere. Don't I need more than a snare? Paul asked. I reckon there's an old Salvation Army bass drum around here as well, I said. Paul found the drum in the closet along with a set of bongos. There's no stool, Paul said. Sit on that wooden Coke box, I said. Paul looked a tad uncomfortable but determined. Just let Willie lead you, Oliver said. Wherever he goes, you go. Oliver's instructions proved prophetic. Paul was able to follow my spur-of-the-moment musical meanderings. That's no easy task, but Paul was up to it. It came to him naturally. When we got through, I turned to him and gave a nod of appreciation. He nodded back. That was the first of our meaningful, silent conversations. Over our time together, we'd have millions. It felt good having Paul around, so good that for the next month, he became my drummer on the Western Express. That's about when I started singing Red-Headed Stranger, a song I first heard sung by Arthur Guitar Boogie Smith. I'd sing it for my baby daughter, Lana, who was at home listening to the radio with her mama, Martha, a high-spirited, full-blooded Cherokee who'd become my wife 3 years prior. She was a car hop, a waitress at a Waco burger joint. She was sharp as a tack and drop-dead gorgeous. Was she spoiled? Hell yes, but so was I. Was she stubborn? No more than me. I was broke, but she didn't care. Martha made more money than me, a situation that lasted longer than I care to remember. Mainly, though, we couldn't stay away from each other. I loved Martha, loved all my wives with all my heart, although in the case of Martha, I can't say for sure whether we spent more time fighting or making up. It was a close call. That redheaded song got to me because it was a cowboy story about a man's wandering ways. The character is wild in his sorrow, a man you better not boss or cross, fight or spite, 'cause he's riding and hiding his pain. I related not just because of the color of the hero's hair, but because of his restless spirit. Playing behind me, Paul felt that spirit. A virtuoso drummer would have done a lot more, would have put in all sorts of accents and added a whole lot of flair, but flair and accents weren't what I needed. I needed someone willing to go on that journey with me, not too fast, not too slow, pause when I felt like pausing, and then get back on the trail when it was time to move on. It wasn't anything I had to teach Paul. No explanations were needed. He could feel the offbeat rhythms and rhymes of the red-headed stranger. He could feel the beat of my heart. KCNC didn't give me any money for the musicians who played on the show, but when I was hired at Major Joe's, I could pay Paul $8 a night. That's when we really got to know each other. Major Joe's was another hole in the wall on one of the highways to hell that crisscrossed the city. Back then, there were big-time venues for country music. The Big D Jamboree in Dallas and the All-Star Country Road Show in the Fort Worth Northside Coliseum. Those were places where thousands thronged to hear Elvis sing Don't Be Cruel and Gene Vincent and his Blue Caps do Bebopalula. At Major Joe's, we'd be lucky to get a couple dozen paying customers. A couple dozen, though, could cause a small riot, which is why we were protected by a sheet of chicken wire strung up in front of the bandstand. As it turned out, I didn't need protection from someone looking to launch a beer bottle. I needed protection from one of my many fascinations, women. I loved smart women, witty women, and shapely women. I was especially vulnerable to women who showed an interest in me before I made the slightest move. I found that exciting. Most musicians will admit that getting girls is a main motivation for going on stage. Ladies like men who make pretty music. As a young man, I took my marriage vows seriously, but seriousness had its limits. I told myself I wouldn't go chasing, but what if someone chased me, and what if that someone happened to have the sultry eyes of Ava Gardner and the body of Betty Page? What was a man to do? In front of a few dozen dancers, I was standing up there picking my guitar and singing Don't Rob Another Man's Castle, recorded by Eddie Arnold. My favorite version was by Ernest Tubb, who recorded the song with the Andrews Sisters. Of course, I wasn't thinking all that much about the lyrics, which even quote the Bible about "Thou shalt not steal." Stealing wasn't on my mind. This gal was. She had long brown hair and was wearing a blouse and blue jeans that had to be 2 sizes too small. She was a lot to look at. The more I looked her way, the more she looked at me. Her bright smile seemed to be saying yes, yes, yes as she swayed to the music, twirling around and around to give me a 360-degree view. The closer I came to the mic, the closer she came to the bandstand. Best of all, she danced alone. "Is that lady flashing me the green light?" I asked Paul after we played our last song for the night, "or am I crazy?" "You're not crazy," Paul offered. I figured I'd best obey the traffic signs and get going. She was ready. I can't remember her name, and even if I did, I wouldn't tell you. Discretion is important. That night, I thought I was being discreet when she approached me. I simply shook her outreached hand. "I don't stay far from here," was all she said while slipping me a matchbook from the Landmark Lodge Motel over on Highway 80. On the back, she had written Room 12. Then she turned and headed for the door. She walked slowly, giving me time to take in the view. "What do you think?" I asked Paul, showing him the matchbook. "Careful not to get a speeding ticket driving out there." I packed up my guitar and made my way in a borrowed car. It was late September. The long summer heat had finally given way to what we call football weather. I thought back to those times in Abbott when we roughed it up on a rocky field. As a kid, I played all the sports. I liked contact sports. Driving through the night, I couldn't help but think that romance was a contact sport. This little lady was dying for contact, and I wasn't one to deny her. I passed by the Coyote Drive-In where they were showing a double feature of East of Eden and The 7-Year Itch. I could see dozens of cars parked in front of the giant screen, but hardly a head was visible. One 2-toned Packard Clipper was bumping up and down something fierce. Might have been the full moon. Might have been the starlit sky, but Fort Worth looked mighty pretty. Even the pawn shops, even the liquor stores, even the junkyards. Everything had its own charm. The big neon sign in front of the Landmark Lodge let you know that they had air coolers, televisions, and a swimming pool. It wasn't a dump. My new friend was sitting in the lobby. She saw me pull up and started walking to room 12. I followed and was able to park right in front. "You going to bring in your guitar so I can hear you sing a little more?" she asked. "I never refuse requests," I answered. She had a candle placed on a table beside the bed. When she lit it, the smell of lavender filled the room. She was drinking out of a bottle of bellows-bonded bourbon and offered me a swig. I accepted. Neither of us was feeling any pain. She sat on the edge of the bed, always trying to comport myself in a gentlemanly manner I knew better than to move too fast. We had all night. I sat in an easy chair in the corner, took out my guitar, and started to strum. "I got a request," she said, "but it's a corny one. I don't mind corn. You know Deep in the Heart of Texas?" I'd be a damned fool if I didn't. As I started singing about stars at night being big and bright, prairie skies being wide and high, sage in bloom smelling like perfume, the lady took her time. One button at a time, she undid her blouse. Inch by inch, she unzipped and stepped out of her jeans. She reclined on the bed, a sight to behold. I put down my guitar, but she wanted to hear more. This time, something real romantic, she said. Singers sing for their supper, so I had no problem accommodating. I was a patient man. "What's your favorite romantic tune?" I asked. "What's yours?" I answered with "A Sinner Kissed an Angel," a song Frank Sinatra had sung when he was with the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra. For all my love of the country music heroes, Jimmy, the singing Brakeman Rogers, Hank Williams, Hank Snow, Ray Price, and all the rest, Sinatra was my favorite singer. There was something about his phrasing. He had that 18-karat gold longing in every word. His voice was his heart. As I sang, my friend closed her eyes and leaned back. I strummed the last chord and was ready, finally ready, to embrace all that bliss when we were both startled by a thunderous knock on the door and a man's voice yelling, "Who you got in there with you?" The man didn't sound friendly. The lady jumped off the bed and put on a robe. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "You said you were going back to Denton." Changed my mind and turned around. "Why?" "Smelled something fishy. Now open the door. Whoever's in there with you better kiss his sweet ass goodbye." "No one's in here. I heard music." "That was the radio." "Wasn't no radio. If you got another one of those pickers in there, he's a dead man." All the time he was saying this stuff, he kept banging, banging, banging until I was sure he'd break down the door. Though I wasn't the kind of guy who'd always back down from a fight, especially when fueled by liquor, I was hardly prepared. I looked around the room to see what might be available. A razor blade? A penknife? But all I could spot was a pencil advertising Mrs. Baird's bread. Not exactly my weapon of choice. The lady had run into the bathroom and locked the door, leaving me to my lonesome when her caller, her husband? Her boyfriend? Kicked in the door. He looked to be my age, somewhere in his early 20s, but that's where the resemblance stopped. I was thin, he was thick. I was short, he was tall. He was holding a pistol. I wasn't. His eyes were so red I expected to see flames shooting out. My options were limited. I could try to charge him, but that would be suicide. I could try to jump out the window over the bed, but that would also be suicide. I could beg him for my life, but I wasn't the begging type. I could try to reason with him, but reason wasn't on my side. "Do you know who you were just screwing with?" he asked. "Wasn't screwing anyone. Hadn't had time." "Then do you know who you were about to screw?" "A lady I met at a bar." "That's my fiancée." He took a step closer and aimed his pistol at my crotch. "I'm blowing off your balls," he said. "Not if I slice your wrist first." That last voice wasn't mine. It was Paul's. He was standing behind the dude with a Smith & Wesson 12-inch carbon killer blade pushed just hard enough into the back of the man's right wrist to draw a drop of blood. My assailant put down his gun. "Grab your guitar," Paul said to me, "and let's scram." That's just what we did. An hour later, we were down on Taylor Street, sitting on a bench at Bailey's Barbecue, chewing on brisket and greasy fries, best meal of the week. Aside from thanking Paul, I hadn't said much. Neither had he. We were both more interested in eating than talking. That's how it was between me and Paul. It was always good timing. I can't explain it. Don't want to explain it. Mysteries are mysteries because they can't be solved. Otherwise, you'll ruin the mystery. The mystery between me and Paul had to do with us always being in the right place at the right time. I didn't tell him to show up at that motel seconds before I was about to get my nuts blown to bits. He just sensed that I needed backup. When he started drumming behind me, he had no experience. That made it better because he worked on instinct. He knew, musically speaking, that I moved on instincts that were unpredictable. He soon saw that was also how I led my life, moving from one city to another at quirky times for quirky reasons. Paul knew not to ask why. That's because he knew I didn't know why. Understanding without explaining is a hell of a thing between two human beings. It wasn't that me and Paul weren't curious about each other. We were, and it wasn't that we didn't respect each other. We did. It's just that we knew not to fret about our pasts or worry about the future. Paul was a right here and now kind of guy. Life was never about tomorrow or yesterday. It was about sitting at Bailey's Barbecue and digging into the brisket. We washed down the meal with mugs of black coffee. After long minutes of silence, Paul said one word: women. He didn't say it disparagingly, he just said it, then he repeated it: women. What about them? I asked. Damn few men have them figured out. How about you? Nope, I come from a place where the women were mainly looking to get married. Where's that exactly? Born in Harold, just outside Vernon. You know where Vernon is? West of Waco by the Red River? That's right. That's a big place compared to where I grew up. Thought you were from Dallas. Nope, I said. Abbott, 25 miles north of Waco, population 500. I figured you as big city. You figured wrong, and I figured you as a Fort Worth slicker. I've been here most of my life, but I'm not all that slick. I messed up early and hard. How? Spent 9 months in jail when I was 17. What'd you do? Didn't understand women, one in particular. She was 10 years older. Showed me things I'd never seen before, things I'd never imagined before. She turned me inside out, had me feeding out of her hand, told me about these rich folks who were out of town, talked me and a buddy into going by their house and breaking in. I chickened out. I stayed in the car while my buddy slipped through a window. He was so scared he didn't do much more than raid the refrigerator. No money, no jewelry, and a no-good 1942 Nash that crapped out just as we were pulling away. Here come the cops. Here comes the court date. Here comes the $20 lawyer hired by my dad. Here comes the sentence, 9 months. Sitting in a cell, working the fields, picking peas. I liked working the fields. So why you out here then? Music's in my bloodstream. I can see that, and I can see what music does to the women. That must be good for your bloodstream as well. I smiled. Paul nodded. He took out his pack of Lucky Strikes and offered me one. We smoked in silence, the smell of strong tobacco filling the air. We took our last puffs and went back for more coffee. Paul was still toying with that old memory. Back there in jail, he said, I learned more than how to pick peas. Old-timer set me straight, said, if you're going to be a thief, you can be the best thief in the world, but you best plan on spending most of your life in jail. If you want to make real money and keep your young ass out of jail, get into the rackets. You'll wind up dealing with a better class of people. And that's what you've done? So far. But I got other interests. Me and Oliver just bought a used car lot over on North Main. Oliver never mentioned that. Oliver don't want you to get messed up in my schemes. He sees you as Mr. Music. Oliver is Mr. Music, not me. Oliver can play. I play at it. You play at it good. Singing, leading a band, charming the ladies. Which isn't easy if you don't have a car. Paul gave me a funny look. You want a car? I sighed. Who doesn't? You trust me? Yeah. Enough to sell you a car? Why not? There are no bigger thieves than used car salesmen. You just told me you swore off thieving early on. Paul smiled and sipped. You like convertibles, he asked. Who doesn't? Got a 1946 Buick, jet black with blood red upholstery. One owner, you can have it for $175. I don't have that much cash on hand, I said. I'll sell it to you on time, $25 down, the rest when you can. What do you say? I say yes. Sight unseen, sight unseen. Paul offered his hand, and I shook it with zeal. The Buick turned out to be a beauty. I later learned that only a week earlier the car had cost Paul $250.
Thank you for spending time with us, and we hope you enjoyed this episode of Listen Here. Check back next week for more audiobook samples and maybe a special guest or two. Follow us wherever you listen to podcasts, or find us on Instagram and TikTok at Listen Here Podcast, or visit our website, listenhearepodcast.com, for more information or to find the books we've talked about.